SwayamPrabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Welcome back. In lecture 4, we will cover urban utilities. So, the different concepts that we will cover are utility networks and the different issues, transformation of utility providers in the global context, full privatization of utility providers, public-private partnerships in this particular space, then PPP projects in India, and then we will look into the service delivery principles, because utilities, unlike any other kinds of planning, utilities planning also involves a particular service that has to be delivered for an urban area. So, there are different stakeholders to it, and then there are different agencies which actually deliver these particular services. So, both the service quality, then the agency itself, the company itself, the operation maintenance that comes along with it, the initial capital investment, all these things needs to be looked at, which is different from maybe planning for land use or maybe planning for others, spatial planning. So, we will look into the service delivery principles, and finally, we will look into issues related to service delivery and urban planning, how service delivery affects urban planning. So, when we talk about the different urban utility networks, basically in today's context, when we look into the modern cities and we look into how it performs in the economic, social and the environmental space, or in this particular domains, it all depends on the quality of this particular utility networks or infrastructure grids that are there in our cities. So, we have our land use or land cover and land use that we have learned earlier, and then we have our different networks including transportation, then there are water supply networks, then there are sewerage networks, drainage networks. So, these are the different infrastructure grids that are put inside our city, and of course, the better they perform, better is the performance of the city. For example, if our drainage network performs to the fullest extent, then automatically or it performs efficiently, then we will not have water logging, we will not have urban flooding issues, and that will actually increase the economic efficiency of that particular city. So, in this particular way, utility networks are very, very important in today's context. So, some of the main issues that we see in today in regards to utility networks and infrastructure, that is people are demanding better quality of services. They also want higher quantity of services. For example, the amount of water that they want is more than what what people used to require earlier or demand earlier. There is change in both the demand for better quality of service as well as quantity, and but problem is many of our urban areas are facing this old infrastructure and all these networks, and because there has been neglect in terms of the investment that is required to maintain this kind of infrastructure. So, there have been some deterioration of our networks. So, there is a need for upgradation of these networks, and then the thing is, people are willing to pay for this kind of services, but they want it to be environmentally sustainable, and the cost of investment for this environmentally sustainable systems is definitely more. So, you need to invest a lot of money at the beginning. So, this actually plays a role in determining the eventual implementation of that particular system. And then in today's context, most of the governments are having a lot of issues with spending. That means when it comes to services like water supply, sanitation and all, government has a lot of spending constraint, because you require a lot of money to start these kind of projects at initially. And then involvement of the private sector in the utility sector, there has been a lot of involvement by the private sector, but it is still inadequate. We need to increase this kind of involvement. Now, let us look at the near future. As we know that India's urban population is projected to grow to around 600 million by the year 2031, and this requires huge amount of investment for all the different utility infrastructures and services. And as for example, you can see that here it is mentioned that at 2009-10 prices, and for the year 2012 to 2031, there has been an estimate where it talks about a total investment of around 7,54,000 crores of rupees that is required to be invested in this particular sector, and this comes to around 13,000 rupees per capita. So, this is the capital investment that we are talking about that is required for this particular sector, and this is approximately around 24% of the entire investment that should go into the urban sector. And similarly, the capital investment is only one part of it, but every year we also put a lot of money for maintenance of this kind of systems. So, you see that the annual operation and maintenance cost comes to around rupees 840 per capita, which is around 8 lakh crores, right? And this is around 41% of all operation maintenance requirement for the urban sector. So, a huge amount of money is required to maintain our infrastructure grids, which are basically the essential services that are required to sustain any kind of city. So, that is the importance of this particular sector. Now, when we look into utility service providers, basically when we are talking, the service is one part. That means we have to first design the service, that is what is required, and then based on the population, based on the terrain, based on the geographical features, we actually design the networks that should be provided. We determine the flows in the network and so on, but this is one part. But at the same time, somebody has to provide these particular services, somebody has to run the pumps every day to supply water, somebody has to run the treatment units, right. So, that is where the utility providers comes in, and these are basically companies. They could be either government run companies or government right organizations or companies, or it could be private companies, and so these are different organizations which actually run this kind of services. So, we have seen a huge transformation in the utility providers both in India as well as in the global context, and gradually how this transformation took place, that I will elaborate. First of all, during the 19th and the early 20th centuries, every utility provider was actually a private company, right. So, that means all this urban water systems were financed, built, owned and operated by private firms, both for American and European cities. We are talking mostly about American and European cities in this context. So, this actually resulted in, like, these were small private companies which are operating this kind of services for smaller areas, and this resulted in private monopolies, resulting in abuse. Now, what are monopolies? That means only one firm is there to provide you the services. So, if there is only one firm, they can charge you any kind of money, or they can you have to be dependent on whatever the service they provide. So, that is monopolies, right. So, private monopolies, and that actually increased the deteriorated the service quality, because of course, private operators wants profit. Then they because utility service is such a domain where a lot of infrastructure is required, we found that gradually the service providers were unable to invest in this particular sector to grow. So, there was lack of investment, and then of course, there was disregard of service quality, because they were only looking into their own profit. So, this actually led to nationalization of many of these water utilities, particularly water utilities, and but still few private companies kept on operating in UK and US, but most of the companies became nationalized. That means the government took over, right. So, this is that means the government outright took the entire company, and then the ownership of the assets and the responsibility of maintenance, everything went to the government. But there has been a different model also that has been explored in countries like France and Spain, where private companies were involved in a different way. And there they were involved as a partner with shared responsibilities, and the local governments basically retained the assets, whereas the private operator was responsible for management. So all the basic capital, infrastructure, all the different infrastructure, land, everything was owned by the government, whereas the private companies were engaged to operate those kind of systems. Now, how it was possible? It was possible through different kinds of contracts, right? So, based on different levels of responsibility and risk of the private partner, depending on the contract, there were different kinds of contracts. There were concessions and there were management contracts, which actually basically means concessions is where the private entity also has to invest some amount of money. They were responsible for the services and so on. Whereas in management contracts, the private entity is not actually required to invest any money. They can just manage the operations, right? Whereas the capital investment, like for setting up a new water treatment unit or laying up distribution lines, these were responsibility of the government. So this kind of contracts were formed, and actually based on these contracts, there was this operation maintenance that was taken up for this particular cities or this particular urban areas. And these were we can say that these were the first examples of public-private partnerships. Now, so looking at the history, during the 1980s, as we have discussed, most of the state, most of the government took over this public utility services, right? So these were state utility companies, right, or state utility organizations, right? Now, that means government started operating this particular utility providers, and by 1980s we were seeing that the service provided by the government also has a lot of issues, or there were a lot of new issues started cropping up. What were this? And because of lack of finances on the part of the government, they were unable to expand, and that actually resulted in, but the population didn't stop expanding, population kept on growing, and so that resulted in a lot of water rationing issues. That means people were given less quantity of water. Then because these are government entities, then there was a lot of political interference, then a lot of people were taken up for jobs, the excessive staffing was there. And as you know that government services, if there are a lot of people and then the work probably is not well distributed or managed, then it resulted in inefficiency and poor service quality. And then because these were linked with the government elections or with the political, the outcome of particular, because if you suddenly increase prices of a particular this water or any other kind of utility service, immediately there was an impact on the political outcome, right? So government set tariff below cost, and tariff revisions were very, very rare, and whenever there was some amount of tariff revision, there was a lot of protest from the people, and we see this usually in India as well, right? And tariff was not a priority also by the government, and because government usually invested a lot of money, there were government grants, and because these were state entities, they waited for the government to provide them whatever deficit was there, and they also didn't really care too much about the customers. So, and the other thing was this kind of companies were mostly interested in building large projects, because in that case they were trying to generate they were new investments were coming in because of that, but there was lack of interest in running those particular systems once they were constructed. That means operation and maintenance was neglected by most of these particular state utilities, and this resulted in a lot of suffering, and people defaulted, they didn't pay money, and they also didn't want to increase tariff because the services were poor. So this actually created a lot of problems, and that actually required some amount of change. That means people was willing to some kind of change or reform in this particular state utilities. So during the early 1990s, the need for this tariff revision was felt from the government's end, whereas people have lost their trust on these public utilities, and then there was a overall lot of deliberation on this, and there was a consensus emerged that public management should be replaced with private management, and this could be again done with different kinds of contracts or different kind of levels of privatization. And this contracts basically meant that for a certain amount of money or certain kind of incentive, these companies will be running this kind of system, and they would be giving a particular level of service, right? So they have to provide a certain kind of service for a certain kind of financial incentive, right? So obviously this seems to be a better option compared to what was going on. And because as we know that private operators are usually more efficient, because they tend to focus on the profit part. So of course they are more efficient than government entities. And then there also was a contract, that means between the government as well as this private contractor. So that means there are stated objectives, and there are stated levels of service that you have to meet. So which was pretty clearly stated and all, and that has to be met. So to meet this particular contract, the private operator really has to work hard, at the same time the efficiency increased in this particular process. And the regulations and the policies that were taken for provision of service or for expanding the service, this was the government's responsibility. That means government took decisions on what kind of service to be provided, at what cost to be provided, all these policy regulations. And then also not only that, they also checked on if this kind of regulations were adhered to by this particular company, and eventually the provision of services were the private operator's responsibility, the entire provision of services. So this is how there was a division of duty among the government as well as the private, and that was the beginning of this public-private partnerships. So when we talk about privatization, that means once the private companies was involved, then it is still some amount of the government control was there, and government could be owning the entire company, but they were giving it to be run by some company. So that was one level of privatization. But there was also a lot of full privatization. That means instead of keeping these particular companies in the public domain, the government was also willing to transform the ownership or this capital infrastructure that they have developed to private entities, so that they are fully responsible for both expansion of this particular entities as well as operation and maintenance of these utilities and services. So in many developed countries, full privatization actually meant that the government completely withdrew from this utility sector, right? So we can say that there was a huge transformation where state utility, and they were monopolies as well. That means they were, because at every city there was one entity which provides the services. So it was a monopoly, and these were responsible for delivering and maintaining all this essential service. As you know that utility services are all essential services. And this state utility monopolies now transformed into this lightly regulated private companies. That means they were private companies, so they can operate on their own profit, whatever profit motivation that they are, based on that they will operate. But they were some way regulated as well, but it was lightly regulated. And that actually ensured a lot of competition among these utility services, both for getting those contracts or owning those particular entities in a particular area. And you can say that this competition actually led to better kind of services to be delivered for the consumer, right? To summarize, we can say that when we talked about state utility monopolies, at least there were some standard service levels. That means government maintained a basic standard. There were fixed tariff, and there was cross subsidy. That means government actually subsidized a lot of this cost, and actually that actually kept the tariff low. And the other big thing that influenced urban planning was because these are big companies, and they have got a lot of excess capacity, they facilitate urban expansion and real estate development. That means when the government wanted a particular a part of the city to grow, or they have constructed a satellite township just outside the periphery of the urban area, they wanted their state utilities to actually extend the infrastructure over there. But this was not the case when this full privatization took place. Why? Because private companies, until unless they know that what will be the in future, if somebody is going to stay there or not, until unless they are sure about it, they will not provide the infrastructure, or they will invest in that particular infrastructure. Right. So that was another issue that actually is this real estate development, or this urban expansion actually suffered. So in case of lightly regulated these private companies, as you know that this maximization of profit is the primary goal, and because of that there was no excess capacity. That means they only provided that much service that is required. They were not interested in expanding their reach or expanding the infrastructure if there was a surety of profit that has to be made out of it. So that's the basic difference that we were discussing. And in addition to that, because this kind of companies were smaller in nature and they operated in very niche spatial and economic markets, that means we are creating these small markets. Instead of having a overall uniform market, we are having this heterogeneous market that is arising at different locations, right? So that actually may ensure that different kind of services were available in different parts of the country. So this is another issue that resulted from this kind of privatization. So we are now back at full circle. That means we started with private companies and then we went to government. The government was not effective in managing this kind of services. So again it gave back control to the private companies. So to summarize, we can say that water, waste, liquid waste, solid waste, these are all public and semi-public goods, right? Now, because there is transformation from state utilities to private companies, then this we can call them now as private commodity or goods. So that means we have to pay money, and that has to be as per market forces, as per market rates. So this transformation took place. And whenever in case of the state monopoly, more or less services were standard across the country. So locational variations were more or less equalized. But when these smaller companies came in, there are multiple providers, and that led to very, very complex markets. That means smaller markets, heterogeneity in the service provision, the cost structure, the tariff structure, and so on. And this actually also resulted in sort of geographical polarization between the localities. That means some locality could say that, well, we have a better service compared to the other localities, so they were able to attract more investment. So this kind of issues started cropping up. So these are the different issues that we can see that that we should be also aware of, because in India also we are at a stage where we are also giving a lot of we are making not only PPPs, but we are also giving responsibility of operation to many of the private companies. So we should know about this particular issue so that we can also manage this kind of services in our country as well. Now, to show you an example or a case study, this is a case study from England and Wales, and we are and this is about the water privatization over there and the regulatory framework that was developed. And we saw that during the 1980s, water supply and sewerage services in this particular England and Wales, this was provided by around 1400 public water and sewerage services. That means these were small urban bodies or municipalities where this kind of services were provided, and there were 1400 of them, which covered around 75% of the population. Plus there were 29 private water companies which covered around 25% of the population. Now all these 1400 public water and sewerage services were consolidated into 10 regional public water authorities, right? Now what are these regional public water authorities? And these are basically companies which the government formed, even though it's a government company, but it's a company operating under private law. It's owned by the government, but it is operated as a private company. Like in India, we develop certain similar kind of entities like special purpose vehicles and all, where we actually, the government makes a company where there are different stakeholders in that company, and it operates under private law. And that means we actually sort of we will here use this term ring fencing. That means the accounts, of that particular company or the operation of the company, the staff of this company is ring fenced. That means that they are separate from the government, right? So they could be prosecuted under law as a company, and also they are responsible to provide services. They can set tariffs, they can set independent tariffs and all, which is not linked by, they would be regulated by the government, of course, but they are not directly, they are not part of the government, right? So, this 10 companies, what were their responsibilities? So, they are supposed to provide water supply and sewerage services in particular areas. Their shares were sold through public offerings, right? And the government actually, this water and sewerage assets were transferred to this private sector. That is to private investors, because shares are being sold, and license to operate the systems and collect tariff from customers that was provided to them. That means they are now responsible for taking tariff or taking charges from the customers, and they have this license to operate this kind of services, right. So, this is the transformation that actually happened, and the government's role is as a regulator. That means they devise the regulatory framework based on which this company or these services would be managed, and this was done by two offices. This was done by the Office of Water Services, and they create the so this is the regulatory agency for this particular sector, for of course UK and this England and Wales, and the regulatory mechanism was sort of a price cap methodology with tariff reviews occurring every 5 years. And company retain the savings if it was able to reduce cost below the set prices. So, that means the price was set by the government, and every 5 years they were supposed to review the tariff, and the company, if it was able to make profits by providing the services at a lower cost, then they can retain those profits, right. So, but every 5 years there was a review of these prices or tariffs, and then they could actually increase that. So, in addition to this kind of privatization, there were also public-private partnerships, as we are discussing, and this is where PPP projects in this particular sector, where we can say that delegation of responsibility to provide urban water and sanitation services, this was achieved through contracts with the private operator, and the private operator mostly took care of the management of that particular utility. But there are different forms of private public partnerships, like for example, there were divestures, then there were concessions, then lease affirmages, management contracts, mixed ownership companies, and then we have heard build, operate and transfer projects, and they could also be just for technical assistance and service contracts, right. Divestitures is where infrastructure assets are sold totally to the private investor, that means full transformation or full ownership transfer. Concession is where private operator is responsible for both operation and some amount of investment, not maybe the entire investment. Lease affirmages is where private operator operates the system, publicly owned system, the ownership retained with the public agency or the government, and the private operator collects revenues and shares some of the profit with the public authority. And management contracts, like publicly owned utility, is just managed by the private operator. That means they are responsible for tariff collection, provision of services, day-to-day operation and maintenance, right. So, these are management contracts, and then there were mixed ownership companies, which are something similar to concessions, where a private investor holds the minority share, operates it and shares the financial gains with the government. And in addition, there were very simple, like contracts could be also just given for certain parts of the entire maintenance and operation, or the entire operation could be divided into contracts for smaller companies. Now, the PPP projects are unique because there are both the government and both the private operator involved in this. So, the efficiency of this kind of project, or to run this kind of projects, is not that easy. There are a lot of challenges involved. So, the efficiency depends on the design of this particular contract. In most cases, the contract based on the contract targets, based on the government's regulatory policies, the regulatory framework, government subsidies for some amount of subsidies, maybe for capital investment, and the finance mechanisms. All this determined how efficiently this particular partnership operated. So, we saw that as you can see in this graph, PPP arrangement in developing countries, like you can see over here, we have got Europe and Central Asia, then Middle East and North Africa. Over from 1991 onwards, this PPP kind of project started, and this dotted line actually shows the number of PPP projects that have been initiated. So, the maximum it was around 2000, and then gradually we saw this number of projects coming down. So, the number of projects around 2007 is around 10 PPP projects in this, in particularly in developing countries, right. So, we can see that in this PPP is a successful to some extent. That means PPP kind of operations are successful, but initial models, like initially during the 1990s, mostly it was the concession model that actually didn't work. That means concession model was where the private entity also was supposed to invest some amount of money, but actually there were a lot of issues. I will discuss that, but usually this kind of models didn't work, and eventually what happened, around 2000s the second generation project started, where the public authority were responsible for financing the investment, whereas the private operator was only responsible for management. Right. So, we saw a lot of lease FMH contracts maybe in Africa and Eastern Europe, and then we saw some concession models also, but most of the capital expenditure, almost all of the capital expenditure was taken care of by the government. But this PPP arrangements has got a lot of positives, but because there were some inherent weaknesses in these projects because of weak institutions. That means the institutions from the government side which were actually implementing these projects, poor governance from the government's part, of course, enforcement of contracts. There was poor enforcement of contracts. That means once the contract is awarded and the work is done, then to enforce those particular contracts or to penalize on non-provision of services, that was rare actually. Then laws and regulations were not that strong. There were always ways around. So, these are some of the issues that actually we have observed in this particular kind of projects. So, in India, we have seen similar kind of similar issues. For example, during the early 1990s, after the economic liberalization, we saw that some of the projects were related with augmentation of the bulk water. That means the water that the city gets for water supply, and there was a lot of private investment in that particular domain, but most of this failed, right, because of opposition of private investment by. In India, there is a lot of, whenever a new private company comes to operate a government service, people expect that the prices would be raised and all, and there is a lot of protest for that. So, this kind of opposition actually is one of the reasons. Then of course, poor planning is also there. Then in early 2000s, it was mostly the distribution which these private companies were actually made responsible for, and for that there were a lot of management contracts, and but again this also failed, again because of opposition due to private investment and so on. So, 2005 onwards, some new more advanced PPP models were explored, some kind of concession contracts, then management contracts, build own transfer models were also explored. So, one example of the PPP project is the Karnataka Urban Water Supply Improvement Project, and this was a demonstration project for 24/7 water supply, and this was taken up in 2005, and it was a performance based management contract for 4 years. So, that means based on the performance of the system, the new targets would be set and actually the services could be improved. So, this was meant for implementing 22,000 new connections in 5 zones across 3 cities in this Hubli, Dharwad, Belgaum and Gulbarga, and this is to provide 24/7 water supply services, right. And public funding was there, and private operation and maintenance for 2 years with performance targets. So, after 2 years the target would be enhanced, and the contract was awarded to Veolia. It's a French company, and it was awarded in 2005. Total funding was around for $52.7 million, and this was US dollars, and then most of it was provided by World Bank, like 40 million was by World Bank, whereas around 12 million by government of Karnataka. and most of this went into the physical investment, that is $48 million went to physical investment, that is infrastructure, whereas implementation and support and development and technical assistance took the rest of the amount. Now, it was a good project. It was the performance of the project was a success, and it was a successful implementation of 24/7 supply, and there was 50% increase in connections and 5 times increase in revenue billed and 7 times increase in revenue collected. So, you can see that the difference between billed and collected also actually reduced, right. So, that means you are effectively collecting more amount of revenue, right, and also you can actually collect more amount of money because there were more the losses in the systems were reduced, as well as more account, all the records and all these things, or the checkings and all these things could be done in a more efficient manner. So, we found that the consumption also, the other benefits, the consumption also increased because of 24/7 services. It was increased to 91 liters per day per person, and supply reduced by 10%. So, even though consumption increased, supply was reduced because the water losses were actually reduced. Non-revenue water 6 to 18%. From 40%, that means 40% of the water we cannot charge money because of losses and a lot of other issues, illegal connections and so on. But it was reduced to around 18%, which is a good achievement actually. 80% of operating cost recovery, and then capital cost was around rupees 11,000 per connection, and then of course poor households, they didn't have to deposit for water connection, and tariff based on volume. That means the tariff was set based on the amount of water consumed. So, this was a very successful project, and this project demonstrated that PPP works in Indian context if we really design it properly. And most of the focus was on the distribution part, and lot of two primary highlights that I would like to say. One was grievance redressal. That means this was made very, very efficiently. That means whenever there was a complaint, it was actually addressed. And the other is involvement of this local water use committees of involving local citizens, not only for raising awareness and also for understanding what was there earlier and what we were able to provide. And that means this social intermediation and communication strategy played a huge role in the success of this particular project. So, as we see in this particular project, we had lot of public funding, and the public funding was utilized, whereas private sector expertise was also utilized. So, both of them were combined to result in a more successful project. So, one indirect economic gain was property values also, because we are now providing better services and infrastructure, the property values increased by 40 to 60%. So, that is a indirect economic gain resulting of this kind of projects. So, this is an example of a successful PPP implementation, but there have been other projects where there was other issues, maybe some failures as well. So, based on our discussion, we have to be careful about the different issues that could rise from this kind of partnerships, and what we have to take care when this kind of partnerships has to be designed, or this contracts has to be designed. Okay. So, now we will quickly discuss on the service delivery principles. Whenever there is a utility provider, it is a private or a government entity, and then there is people. That means the service has to be delivered to the people. So, there has to be certain basic principles whenever we design this kind of systems, right. So, as urban planners, whenever you are designing a certain kind of service for a particular urban area, we can design the tariff, we can design what kind of service should be provided, how the network would be enhanced, all these policies could be designed, right. So, there are some principles that we should follow. So, what are these? The first one is decentralized service delivery improves accountability. That means the more decentralized the service delivery is, it basically improves accountability, and that is the view of the government. And but to ensure that this happens, there has to be the communication, as well as this operational frameworks, or this management frameworks, which has to integrate the state level organization, with the urban local body, with the WSS or water or sanitation service, whatever the situation may be, that service provider. So, one is the utility provider, one is the urban local body, which sometimes also provides this kind of services, right, on their own, and the state level organization which are responsible for maybe capital investments and so on. So, there has to be sort of the roles defined for each one of them through some sort of a framework, and that has to be ensured that services are delivered in the most decentralized way possible. Then state specific policies, that means based on that particular state we have to design policies which suit that particular state, both in terms of service provision, regulation, financing, professional development, performance management, monitoring and evaluation and so on. So, that has to be state specific policies, that means custom policies for different areas. Then we have to look into improvement of the governance part of this particular service providers maybe, and and how we can achieve that, and the ULB, the city level parastatal, the state level parastatal as both service provider and creator of capital assets. That means the parastatal agencies are basically government agencies which may be also operating in a private, as we are discussing, that they could be made into a private, they could be made to operate as a private company as well. So, this parastatal agency, city level or state level parastatal agencies along with the municipality, or maybe they are not operating the actual system, they are actually building the infrastructure. So, they should be responsible for creation of the capital assets. So, this is the first point. Then ring fencing of the assets, staff and accounts of WSS activities. So, that means this I was talking about earlier, that means if we are making this WSS service provider independent of the government, that means they can operate it, they can operate it on their own rules, they can frame their own regulations, of course based on the broader regulations of the government, then tariff levels, their expansion plans, everything is on their own. In that case, we also need to ring fence their assets or staff and the accounts, so that they cannot be integrated with other government agencies and so on, and this has to be a separate entity altogether. So, then comes the creation of independent utilities or corporatization of public sector services, that is that ring fencing is all about, and we corporatize the public sector services and make them into independent utilities, and or we can go for direct public private partnerships as well. So, these are the different ways we can actually achieve capital and performance efficiency, sustainability, customer orientation and attainment of service level benchmarks, and improvement of service quality. So, these are the targets, and to achieve that, these are some of the ways we can improve governance of the utility service providers. Then the ULB also should be made responsible, like all the assets should be the ownership of the asset and provision of services. Ultimately, the ULB has to take responsibility both for setting the tariffs, then for billing and collection to some extent as well. ULB has to have some kind of responsibility, and not everything has to be given to the utility provider. Then there has to be multi-ULB cooperation, and this actually helps because in many cases, like for example, drainage water from one area can move to the next area. So, there has to be an integrated drainage plan both for these areas. So, that is where multi-ULB cooperation actually works or is required actually. And regional service provider models could be something like a special purpose vehicle for provision of bulk. That means this SPV can actually, or a company could actually get bulk water supply for both the ULB together, and that may actually reduce the prices as well. So, this kind of SPVs could be also formed. Then regulatory mechanisms through an independent agency which can set the standards, monitor performance, and it can adjust the tariffs, right. Then financing, we have to look into both short term and medium term financing, and ULB could be responsible for operation and maintenance and the recovery of those costs. State should be responsible for the capital investment, and in medium term recovery of operational maintenance cost and both capital investment. So, initially in the short term ULB the state should pay for the capital investment, whereas ULBs would only collect the money for the services. But in future, both capital investment also has to be borne by the customers. That means both recovery of operation and maintenance cost and capital investment cost has to be borne by the customers, right. So, gradually in the medium term, we have to go towards that kind of a system. Then for tariff restructuring by this particular utility service providers, there has to be some amount of autonomy in that. That means there has to be up and downs in the charges as per the market rates. And then there has to be, before any kind of projects, there has to be detailed project reports which considers all the cost components and their what could be the suggested rates for user charges. If we don't do that, that actually leads to a lot of this problems later on. People may not, if those things are not known earlier, then that is why people will protest. But if all this information is given before and before a project is initiated, then this problems doesn't arise. And finally, tariff should be linked to power tariff as well. Why? Because we know that 50% of operation and maintenance cost is actually because of the power charge. So, because power tariff fluctuates, so that has to be linked with the tariff of this water supply and sanitation services. Otherwise, we would so that will help us to actually recover the cost in a more efficient manner. So, the other thing is, whenever we are talking about the service delivery principles, we have to make sure that the contracts to private entities, as we were discussing, that a lot of these PPP projects are being taken up, and we need to involve the private sector in different capacities. And of course, we can give management contracts, service contracts, performance contracts, design, build and operate contracts. Different kind of contracts could be given. But there is a lot of issues that needs to be considered in the Indian context. What are these issues? One is, in many cases, the private company is asked to take up operation management of an existing plant, right? And a lot of data is not there. A lot of issues are there in that particular project. So, we can call them brownfield projects. These are not greenfield projects. These are not fresh projects. So, these are old projects. And because of that, there may be a lot of cost escalation, and that is where this kind of provision has to be there in the PPP contract, that if certain those kind of issues crop up, there has to be negotiation, renegotiation of the contract and so on. Otherwise, it increases the risk for the private operators, right? And they will probably not be willing to take up those kind of contracts. Then poor capital investment efficiency due to availability of public fund. So, this is one problem. So, instead of replacement, we can talk about rehabilitation. That means rehabilitation of sewer networks. That means instead of just taking relaying of or replacing the entire existing old infrastructure, we can rehabilitate them. That can actually reduce the cost. And we have to also strengthen the PPP contracts and the penalty clauses. So, these are the things which are missing in many contracts now. Then institutional arrangement between the ULBs and the parastatals that I was talking about, there has to be sort of a framework of cooperation between this. Staff transition issues, whenever you are converting into a private company from a government company, the staff also needs to be transitioned. So, that is, there are a lot of problems with that. Weak communication and stakeholder engagement, tariff is another sensitive issue. So, these are the different issues that are there. So, whenever we are talking about service delivery, in addition to this, we also need to be thinking about sustainable use of water resources through wastewater reuse, particularly for water supply demand management, reducing water usage, and then distribution system leakage management to ensure equitable social access. So, these are the different issues that has to be thought about when we design services for a particular urban area. Okay. Finally, we come to a group of issues that we have to be careful about whenever we are talking about service delivery by private entities or by organizations. Then this actually impacts urban planning. Like I was saying earlier, that if the government monopolies were actually there, then there was expansion of infrastructure services could be financed by these particular companies, but these particular entities. But as soon as private companies took over, or private company in developed countries, there was, they were not willing to invest so much in expansion and so on, if there was no guarantee of this kind of, profit that could be made out of that. So these are some of the issues how urban planning is also affected because of this utilities or service providers. So few issues that we will touch upon. One is monopoly versus competition, and if as we understand that the competition in utility sector is limited, even after privatization, sometimes we see that only one company operates in one area, no other companies operate. So that is an issue that we really have to take care of. And when this happens, small consumers, unlike commercial users, they don't have a choice. That means they have to choose a particular service provider. They cannot shift to another service provider. Whereas larger consumers, it is more flexible. They can actually, because they buy water or whatever services at a bulk rate, they can actually negotiate with multiple customers, multiple service providers. Sorry. All regions do not have the same degree of competition, and companies sometimes target profitable niche market. That means that only areas where they can profit, they will able to, they will provide services there. So private monopoly, that is another issue, and small consumers may end up paying for large consumers. So these are some of the issues that results from monopoly whenever there is monopoly. And in addition to that, there could be other issues which are related with integration and fragmentation. That means integration of services and fragmentation of services. Utility companies sometimes merge, and they also combine different kind of service packages together. That means if you take this, you also have to take that. You cannot take it from another company. So this kind of packaging happens, and sometimes utility companies merge, and sometimes integrated regional utility providers. This actually is beneficial because they provide economies of scale. They can share the duct space, like every urban area has got these service ducts that are going along along the particular roads and all, through which water supply and other lines or sewerage lines are taken. So this kind of shared duct space, they can share those spaces and reduce the overhead charges because they are merging. So this is the benefits of integration. Whereas for fragmentation, increased competition resulting in fragmentation of service providers and types of services, service quality variation, tariff structure, tariff structure revision, duplication of network infrastructure. So these are the different issues. That means because the service is now broken into smaller companies, provided by smaller companies, you have duplication of the infrastructure, the service quality varies, the tariff varies among these different service providers and so on. So we have discussed this kind of issues. So this is the result when a lot of smaller companies comes in. And also it's difficult to regulate and ensure universal access to basic utility services in these particular cases. Infrastructure provision, we have already discussed. Two ways we can look at it. In case of state utility monopolies, the limited, because these are state companies, they run with their own rules, own policies and all. They didn't engage with the smaller ULBs or municipalities because they didn't care that much, and the reason is they have to provide uniform policies for all areas that they provide. So they didn't provide custom services. So these were some of the issues, and also they didn't have they didn't take much feedback from the particular ULBs, and their coordination was also limited. Whereas whenever private companies came in, because these are smaller entities, they worked in partnership with the ULBs, they were actually able to provide more custom or you can say more effective services. And new infrastructure, but the problem happened is, because new infrastructure provision, if they are not sure of the cost recovery, they will not expand. So that actually affected real estate development in this particular ULBs. So there are both positives and negatives of both having private companies or state utility monopolies. Then access to utilities, that is the issue that we discussed. That means by socioeconomic status or spatially different kind of services were available for different groups. So, this is one issue that we have to look into when there is a lot of fragmentation or services provided by these companies. And sometimes with privatization, we can see that there is a lot of artificially tariffs are kept low, and finally when there is revision, many consumers fail to pay these extra charges, and that leads to disconnection. And sometimes these are not reported as well, that leads to water poverty. And sometimes prepayment meters are used, which actually that means you have to pay money to get the service. This enhances efficiency for the operator, but actually this actually hides the amount of disconnection, because people are just not consuming water. So, that leads to this water poverty and other issues that comes out of that. So, so we need to be aware of the social access indicators as well. That means whenever we are planning for this kind of services in a particular urban area, we need to understand the cost of connection, the levels of connection, disconnection rates for that area, installation of prepayment meters, how many of those meters are prepaid, and cost of low levels of connection. That means what happens when there are a lot of disconnection, what kind of social cost that arises out of it. So, these are other issues that are related with urban planning that we need to investigate when we are looking into utilities planning. Finally, two things that I would like to touch upon. The environmental implications. One is we need to forecast demand, and we meet this demand with improved supply, but sometimes supply actually increases demand, right? But in today's context, we need to look into demand side management. That means we need to reduce consumption. That means we need to reduce the amount, volume, and the time that for this kind of water supply services and all this. And that means we can actually run projects so that we can reduce wastage and reduce consumption. So, that will actually improve sustainability. Instead of supply related investment, that means instead of increase this provision of new kind of infrastructure and all this, which will actually lead to higher demand. So, instead of providing that infrastructure, if we invest our money to reduce the demand in the first place, or increasing reuse within maybe the building itself, that probably is a better option, right? So, this is what we can actually look at. And another issue with privatization is in urban planning, we actually develop this land use planning policies where we want to reduce consumption and we want to reduce the flows along the network, like we want to reduce the water that is going to the sewage treatment plant, we want to we want to reduce the consumption of water. So, all these things that we want to reduce the treatment cost of water. So, all this we want to reduce, but because these are private entity, with privatization what happens, these private companies, they have because they want to enhance the profit, they may have an interest to increase the flow, which may not be sustainable at all. So, these are the issues which we have to evaluate whenever we are deciding on this kind of services. And finally, we have technology implications as well. Utility companies are a big market for IoT and other smart systems. So, and this is smart meters and all are now taking over. So that we can have more enhanced monitoring or management, and monitoring, control and automation of various aspects of urban living or these utilities and services are gradually these are being modified. So, these are the more we have these private companies, we will have more of this kind of systems which increase the convenience, and this kind of technology increases the convenience of using this kind of systems. So, to conclude, we can say that utility companies will have an increasingly powerful role in urban social, economic and environmental planning and management processes. The role of local government is increasingly diminishing in decisions for new networks and regarding renovation and refurbishment of existing networks, and will further reduce with privatization. So, there is a need to determine optimal levels of statutory control and influence on performance and projects of utility companies. And in India, innovative PPP models offer a way to increase service efficiency and private financing. And the focus is gradually shifting to operation and management and improvement of service quality through customer engagement. And finally, care should be taken for tariff setting and for facilitating the corporatization of public sector utilities. These are the references. Thank you.